Could the prince we all admired, the one who championed wounded soldiers, the face of the Invictus Games, actually be under arrest? Could the man who stood before the world as a symbol of honor and dedication now be accused of betraying the very mission he created? The thought alone sends a shockwave through anyone who has followed his journey. And yet, according to sources close to the investigation, this nightmare is exactly what has begun to unfold. It all began with a vision, a dream that touched hearts around the globe. Prince Harry, known for his military service and deep commitment to veterans, wanted to create something lasting, something meaningful. The Invictus Games were meant to celebrate strength, courage, and resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. Stories of soldiers overcoming life-altering injuries, of camaraderie and perseverance, filled newspapers, social media, and the hearts of millions. People cheered. They donated. They believed. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But what if all of that belief was based on a facade? What if the millions of pounds flowing into the Invictus Games weren't always going to the people who needed them most? And what if the man at the center of this story, the prince himself, could be implicated in one of the most shocking scandals of his life? In the first days of what insiders are now calling a financial investigation, whispers of misuse and embezzlement began circulating. At first, these were dismissed as tabloid exaggerations, rumors blown out of proportion. But as documents surfaced, auditors raised questions, and former staffers came forward, the whispers grew louder. They couldn't be ignored. Every report, every leak, every financial irregularity pointed to a troubling reality. Funds that were meant to support veterans were allegedly being diverted in ways that no one anticipated. Imagine the scene. A soldier, injured in combat, training tirelessly for the Invictus Games, counting on a promise of support. He believes that every donation, every sponsorship, every pound raised will directly aid his recovery, his rehabilitation, and his chance to compete. And then, months or years later, he learns that some of that money may have disappeared. Or worse, been mismanaged by the very person who asked him to trust the process. That is the magnitude of what is now being investigated. To fully grasp the gravity of this scandal, we have to look at the man behind it. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, was never content with simply being a member of the royal family. He sought purpose beyond palace walls. His military career shaped him, instilled discipline, courage, and an unwavering commitment to his comrades. When he founded the Invictus Games, it was with the intent to shine a spotlight on those often overlooked, wounded veterans fighting battles that most civilians could not imagine. And the world responded. Sponsors lined up. Crowdfunding campaigns soared. Ticket sales brought in millions. The media coverage was relentless but positive, painting a picture of a prince devoted to service and humanity. The Invictus Games were hailed as a model of compassion and leadership, proof that Harry could channel his fame into tangible change. Yet even in the midst of triumph, cracks were forming behind the scenes. Insiders reported unusual financial practices. Donations were sometimes unaccounted for. Contracts were murky. Payments were delayed or misapplied. Some staffers began asking questions quietly, fearing backlash from a prince who had cultivated a public image of transparency and goodwill. And that tension, as we now know, would explode into a full-blown investigation. But why now? Why is this story breaking today? The timing is critical. It comes after years of intense media scrutiny surrounding the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It comes as Prince Harry has attempted to carve out an independent life outside of royal duties, engaging in media projects, philanthropic ventures, and private enterprises. The scrutiny he faces now is unprecedented, and the stakes are higher than ever. What makes this even more shocking is the duality of Harry's image. On one hand, he is a hero to many, someone who championed vulnerable veterans, someone who spoke openly about mental health struggles and the cost of war. On the other hand, if the allegations hold true, he is facing accusations of betraying that trust, of misusing funds in a way that could have lasting repercussions for those he vowed to support. It's a narrative twist few could have predicted, yet here we are. At this moment, details are still emerging, and much remains unverified. But according to investigative sources, law enforcement is taking this matter seriously. Financial documents, emails, and internal audits are being reviewed. Former employees have come forward with accounts that suggest serious irregularities. Even high-level royal aides are reportedly concerned about the implications for the royal brand, public perception, and the future of charitable trust oversight. Imagine the tension. The media frenzy is building. Headlines are prepared, cameras ready to capture the first moments of what could be a historic arrest. Social media is abuzz with speculation. Supporters of the prince are confused, shocked, and searching for answers. Critics are waiting to pounce. And the world, watching from afar, is left asking, could it really be true? Could the man who once carried a wounded soldier's spirit on his sleeve now be under criminal investigation? This story is more than just numbers on a ledger. It is about trust, betrayal, and the fragile line between public service and personal ambition. It's about what happens when fame, responsibility, and finance collide in ways that no one fully anticipates. And for Prince Harry, it's a reckoning that may change everything. His public image, his family relationships, and his legacy. As we move forward into the heart of this exposé, the questions only grow more pressing. What exactly was misused? How did the alleged embezzlement go unnoticed for so long? Who knew? And when did they know it? And most importantly, what does this mean for the soldiers and veterans who have depended on the Invictus Games for years? And then there's the human angle. What is Prince Harry thinking, feeling, and fearing in these moments? For someone who has spent much of his life under the public microscope, whose every move is analyzed, how does it feel to face allegations that cut to the very core of his work, his mission, and his honor? Could this scandal be the most damaging event of his life, surpassing media controversies, personal struggles, and family disputes? But the most shocking twist is yet to come. Because while the world watches, preparing to judge, there are revelations still hidden from public view. Documents, testimonies, and pieces of evidence that will shock even the most seasoned observers. Pieces of a puzzle that could either vindicate the prince or seal a narrative of betrayal that no one saw coming. Could anyone have predicted that a young prince, born into the glittering halls of royalty, would one day become the face of a global movement for wounded veterans? Prince Harry's story is one of contrasts. Privileged yet empathetic, royalty yet relatable, military-trained yet publicly vulnerable. From the moment he first stepped into the spotlight, Harry carried the weight of expectation. Expectation to behave, to perform, to represent the monarchy with dignity. But he also carried something less visible, a fierce desire to make a difference, to leave the world better than he found it. To understand the magnitude of the current scandal, we have to start here, at the very roots of Harry's mission. Military service was transformative for him. It wasn't merely a rite of passage or a nod to family tradition. It became a lens through which he viewed life, honor, and responsibility. The young prince witnessed firsthand the horrors of war, the sacrifices soldiers make, and the mental and physical scars that follow them home. It was during his tours in Afghanistan that Harry's vision for the Invictus Games began to crystallize. He saw something that many in the public could not. The resilience of human spirit, the unbreakable courage of those who continue despite unimaginable trauma. But he also saw the gaps, lack of support systems, lack of visibility for wounded veterans, and the absence of a platform to celebrate their triumphs. He wanted to create that platform. He wanted a stage where the world could bear witness not just to their injuries, but to their victories. And so, the Invictus Games were born. The name itself, derived from Latin for unconquered, captured the essence of what Harry envisioned, a celebration of resilience, a tribute to the invincible spirit that soldiers carry, even when life tries to break them. The first games were held in London in 2014, and they were a resounding success. Soldiers from dozens of countries competed in sports like wheelchair rugby, track and field, swimming, and sitting volleyball. But beyond the medals and trophies, the games were about something more profound: visibility, dignity, and recognition. Stories from those early games still resonate. There was the British soldier who lost a limb in combat, and yet finished the wheelchair marathon with a smile on his face. There was the Canadian veteran who returned to swimming, breaking personal records and inspiring others with every stroke. Each story was a testament to the very ethos Harry wanted to promote, that nothing, Not even a life-changing injury could conquer the human spirit. The public response was immediate. Donations poured in. Sponsors lined up. Media outlets around the globe covered every event, capturing the emotion, the triumph, and the humanity of the games. Prince Harry, once a figure of royal intrigue and tabloid fascination, was now being celebrated for something real, tangible, and life-affirming. His image shifted. No longer just a prince, he became a champion, a humanitarian, and a symbol of hope for those who needed it most. Yet even at this early stage, there were undercurrents few noticed. Organizing an international event on this scale is no small feat, and managing the millions in donations, sponsorship deals, and operational costs requires meticulous oversight. While Harry focused on the vision, the dream, the stories, and the athletes, the behind-the-scenes machinery was vast and complex. Financial management, audits, staff oversight, all critical components, needed constant attention. The question no one was asking at the time, but would become crucial years later, was this: could the operational side of the games match the moral and emotional vision Harry had for them? In the early days, no one thought to question it. The prince was beloved. His military credentials were unquestionable. His heart seemed in the right place. The stories were inspiring, the coverage glowing. Even those within the organization who noticed minor discrepancies hesitated to speak up, perhaps unwilling to challenge the prince or disturb the narrative of success. The focus was on the mission, the message, and the morale of the participants. But sometimes, even the best intentions are not enough to prevent oversight, or worse, misconduct. It is important to recognize that the seeds of a scandal often lie dormant for years, nurtured by good intentions, public admiration, and trust that everything is being done correctly. By the time small cracks appear, they may have already grown into chasms capable of swallowing reputations whole. During this period, Prince Harry became increasingly hands-on. He wasn't content to simply lend his name or make ceremonial appearances. He attended planning meetings, spoke with athletes, and engaged with sponsors personally. He understood that the games were about more than spectacle. They were about accountability, results, and most importantly, the people whose lives were being transformed. And yet, as responsibilities grew, so did the complexity of managing every facet of the organization. Money flowed in at unprecedented levels, and with it came the unavoidable challenge of ensuring every pound was tracked, every donation properly allocated, every promise fulfilled. Here's where the tension begins, and where the story that will unfold in this exposé truly begins to take shape. For the public, Prince Harry was the face of the Invictus Games, charismatic, compassionate, unflinching in his support for veterans. But behind the scenes, questions started to arise. Staffers noticed irregularities in accounting practices. Certain invoices didn't match expenditures. Sponsorship funds didn't always flow as expected. Minor mismanagement, perhaps, or a sign of something larger. And at this stage, it remained invisible to the public eye, hidden beneath layers of loyalty, admiration, and trust. Ask yourself this: how would you reconcile the image of a devoted prince with the possibility of financial mismanagement occurring under his watch? Could someone so public, so celebrated, truly be implicated in wrongdoing? The cognitive dissonance is almost unbearable, but this is precisely the tension that makes the story compelling. The contrast between perception and reality, between heroism and scandal, between trust and betrayal, is at the very heart of what is about to unfold. Even at this early stage, we begin to see the duality of leadership. Visionaries often inspire, but they also create opportunities for mistakes, misunderstandings, and in some cases, misconduct. Prince Harry's attention was focused on the emotional and human aspects of the games, the athletes, the stories, the public impact. But financial oversight requires a different kind of vigilance, one that depends on systems, audits, and transparency. And when those systems falter, when oversight is lacking, even the best-intentioned leaders can face consequences they never imagined. Yet, it is important to humanize Harry. This is a man who has experienced personal loss, public scrutiny, and the relentless pressure of expectations that few could endure. His commitment to the Invictus Games was genuine. His passion, undeniable. But in the complexity of managing a global charitable organization, passion alone is not sufficient. And therein lies the crux of the unfolding scandal, the collision of good intentions with systemic vulnerability. The foundation had been laid. The dream had been realized in part, with events celebrated and lives touched. The world applauded. But the seeds of a crisis were quietly germinating, unnoticed by those who mattered most. And as the organization expanded, as donations increased, as operations became more intricate, the potential for oversight, or worse, misappropriation, grew exponentially. And now, in 2025, all of that is coming to a head. The prince, once a symbol of hope, is facing allegations that threaten to undo years of work, tarnish his reputation, and shake the faith of those who believed in him. Whistleblowers have emerged, documents have surfaced, and investigators are reportedly examining the accounts with unprecedented scrutiny. The tension that began quietly behind the scenes is now a public spectacle. But perhaps the most gripping question is this: how did a prince, so dedicated to service, find himself at the center of a financial storm? What decisions were made, what oversight failed, and what revelations are still waiting to be uncovered? The answers to these questions are not only shocking, they are essential to understanding the full scope of the scandal. Imagine this: a global stage filled with wounded veterans, cheering crowds, and cameras capturing every triumphant finish. The Invictus Games had arrived, and the world was captivated. But behind the spotlight, another story was quietly unfolding. A story of millions of pounds flowing in, promises made, and a complex financial web that even seasoned experts would struggle to untangle. This is the story of the money trail, and how it would later become the focal point of one of the most explosive scandals of Prince Harry's life. The origins of the Invictus Games are rooted in Harry's military experience. Witnessing soldiers' courage and sacrifice firsthand, he wanted to create a platform that celebrated resilience. But dreams require resources, and resources require funding. Public donations, private sponsors, and government contributions poured into the initiative. On paper, everything looked ideal: a prince-led charity backed by global interest, a compelling mission, and a clear vision for success. However, the scale of the funding quickly became enormous. Tens of millions of pounds entered the organization over just a few years. Major corporations lined up to sponsor events, celebrity endorsements poured in, and ticket sales for opening ceremonies and competitions generated substantial revenue. For many, this was a testament to Harry's ability to galvanize attention and resources for a worthy cause. But the larger the money flow, the more difficult it becomes to maintain strict oversight. This is where the story begins to twist. In any organization handling millions, transparency is critical. Yet insiders have revealed that early financial systems for the Invictus Games were, at best, rudimentary, and at worst, inconsistent. There were accounts opened in various locations, staff members assigned responsibility without clear reporting structures, and contracts that sometimes lacked essential documentation. While Harry's attention was understandably focused on athletes and media engagement, these gaps created opportunities for mismanagement, and potentially worse. Consider the donations from private individuals. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of contributors believed that their funds would directly support rehabilitation programs, travel for athletes, and medical assistance. Yet records show that the allocation of funds was sometimes opaque. Some donations were pooled into general operational expenses rather than being earmarked for specific programs. While this may seem like standard organizational practice, the lack of clarity would later fuel allegations of misuse. Corporate sponsorships added another layer of complexity. Big-name brands wanted visibility, naming rights, and marketing opportunities. Negotiations were often led by teams of advisors, but the terms and conditions were not always fully transparent. Some payments were delayed, others rerouted, and a few contracts lacked proper documentation entirely. In hindsight, these discrepancies, minor at first glance, would later appear far more sinister when investigators began examining every penny. And then there were operational costs. Hosting international events is not cheap. Venue rentals, equipment, travel, security, and accommodations all required meticulous budgeting. On top of this, there were administrative salaries, event planning fees, and promotional expenses. The expenditures were enormous, yet the reporting mechanisms sometimes failed to capture the full picture. This created an environment where errors could slip through unnoticed and where scrutiny might be delayed until external audits were performed. Even more concerning were the reports from insiders who began noticing unusual financial behavior. Staffers noticed payments that didn't align with services rendered, discrepancies in invoices, and funds being moved between accounts in ways that were difficult to trace. Initially, these concerns were raised internally, but many felt intimidated or uncertain about speaking out. After all, the face of the charity was Prince Harry, a royal figure with immense influence and public support. Yet the most critical question remains: were these missteps merely administrative errors, or did they point to something more intentional? This is where the line between oversight and wrongdoing becomes murky. While it is natural for complex organizations to experience occasional errors, repeated irregularities, particularly involving large sums of money, trigger red flags for auditors and investigators alike. And as we now know, the trail would soon lead directly to Harry himself, or at least to his immediate circle of advisors and decision-makers. To put this in perspective, let's consider the scale. According to preliminary reports, tens of millions of pounds flowed through the Invictus Games accounts over a few years. Even small percentages of mismanagement, say 5 to 10%, could equate to millions in unaccounted-for funds. These figures are not trivial. They are enough to fund multiple rehabilitation programs or provide crucial medical equipment for dozens of veterans. The stakes were massive, and the potential fallout even greater. And yet, at this stage, the public remained blissfully unaware. The Invictus Games continued to receive glowing media coverage. Athletes' victories were celebrated. Harry's appearances were covered extensively, with images of him cheering, embracing competitors, and delivering inspirational speeches dominating headlines. No one outside the inner circle suspected the looming storm, but financial investigators were beginning to piece together a different narrative. Leaks from auditors and former staffers revealed that several financial transactions were unusual. Some donations, meant for specific programs, could not be fully traced. Certain invoices appeared inflated or duplicated. Transfers between accounts were executed without clear documentation. To the public, these might seem like small, bureaucratic details, but to regulators and law enforcement, they were significant. This is where curiosity gaps are essential. How could such discrepancies occur in a high-profile charity run by a royal? Who knew about them, and when? How long did these irregularities go unnoticed? And most importantly, were they the result of negligence, mismanagement, or something more deliberate? The complexity of the Invictus Games finances was compounded by the nature of Prince Harry's involvement. While he was undoubtedly passionate about the mission, he was not personally managing every account, invoice, or sponsorship deal. He relied on advisors, accountants, and administrators to handle the technicalities. But as with any delegation, responsibility is never entirely removed. As the figurehead, the ultimate accountability rested with him, a fact investigators would later emphasize when examining the financial trail. This is also where human emotion enters the equation. Many donors felt a deep personal connection to Harry and the Invictus Games. Veterans trusted the charity implicitly. Staff members who had dedicated their careers to supporting the games were caught between loyalty and ethical responsibility. And now, as allegations began to emerge, these relationships were strained, tested, and sometimes broken. The tension was palpable, and the emotional stakes were high. Now, consider the ripple effect. Once financial irregularities were reported, even internally, the implications extended far beyond the charity. Public perception of Harry, already shaped by decades of media attention, would be at risk. Sponsors could withdraw support. Donors could demand refunds. International partners might reconsider participation. And worst of all, the veterans and athletes who had inspired the creation of the games could find themselves at the center of controversy, their achievements overshadowed by financial scandal. It is at this juncture that the story becomes truly compelling. The Invictus Games were no longer just a celebration of resilience. They were the stage upon which a financial investigation would play out, with the Duke of Sussex at its center. Every donation, every sponsorship, every transaction became part of a narrative that blended public admiration with private scrutiny, success with potential scandal, and heroism with alleged wrongdoing. And so, as investigators began tracing the money trail, questions multiplied. Were the discrepancies accidental or deliberate? Who within the organization had knowledge of the irregularities? How deeply was Prince Harry involved? And what decisions had he made, or failed to make, that could have contributed to the alleged misuse? The answers to these questions would shock the public, challenge the royal image, and set the stage for a scandal that could redefine Harry's legacy. What happens when people who were once loyal to a cause suddenly find themselves questioning the very foundation of that cause? When they realize that the mission they devoted themselves to may have been compromised, intentionally or not. This is the moment when whispers become revelations, when suspicion becomes investigation, and when loyalty collides with conscience. For Prince Harry and the Invictus Games, that moment had arrived. It began quietly. Staffers who had spent years working behind the scenes noticed inconsistencies. Small at first, a payment that didn't match an invoice, a sponsorship deal that lacked proper documentation. But small inconsistencies have a way of snowballing when repeated over time, especially when the sums involved reach millions of pounds. For those who noticed, it was a moral dilemma. Do you speak up and risk your career, or do you stay silent and hope no one else notices? Some chose silence. Others decided they could no longer turn a blind eye. The first whistleblowers were anonymous, reaching out to auditors and investigators with carefully documented notes. They provided screenshots of bank transfers, copies of invoices, and emails that seemed to contradict the public narrative of the Invictus Games. These insiders spoke of meetings where concerns were dismissed, where questions about financial oversight were met with reassurances, sometimes with intimidation, and often with a subtle reminder of the prince's influence. They claimed that challenging the system meant challenging a beloved royal, which few dared to do. One former staffer described a meeting where he noticed an invoice for tens of thousands of pounds labeled as equipment costs, yet no corresponding receipts existed. When he questioned the payment, he was told not to worry and that Harry approved it. At the time, it sounded like an innocent administrative note, but looking back, it was part of a pattern, a trail of funds that didn't always match the declared purpose. The staffer later admitted, under anonymity, that the decision to document and share these irregularities with auditors was not easy. He feared backlash, both professionally and personally. These revelations started a chain reaction. More staff members came forward, each providing pieces of the puzzle that collectively painted a troubling picture. Emails were leaked showing conversations about rerouted funds, vague justifications for certain payments, and a lack of oversight for significant sums. Even routine operational costs were occasionally lumped into ambiguous categories that made tracking them nearly impossible. The pattern was emerging, and it was alarming. Curiously, some of the documents indicated that the discrepancies were not limited to a single fiscal year or event. They spanned multiple years, multiple locations, and multiple rounds of sponsorship agreements. Funds that should have gone directly to athlete support, rehabilitation programs, and international travel sometimes ended up in accounts without clear designation. Whether this was due to mismanagement, negligence, or intentional misuse was still unclear, but the trail was undeniable. What makes this especially striking is the duality between public perception and internal reality. The world saw Harry as the hands-on prince, present at every ceremony, speaking passionately about the games, celebrating victories, and sharing the joy of athletes' achievements. Behind the scenes, however, there was an undercurrent of unease. Staffers worried that the mission they believed in might be undermined by operational gaps or worse, by deliberate actions of those with control over the money. One former administrator described hiding documents and making copies, fearing that the next round of audits could sweep irregularities under the rug. Another recounted heated debates over transparency with senior advisors. There was fear, yes, but also moral conviction, the belief that truth had to prevail, no matter the personal cost. And so, one by one, whistleblowers began to compile evidence, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become a full-scale investigation. It wasn't just internal staff who noticed the irregularities. External auditors, brought in to review the charity's accounts, began raising concerns. Their reports highlighted transfers that lacked clear documentation, discrepancies in receipts, and a pattern of repeated approvals without sufficient oversight. For professionals accustomed to examining corporate and charitable accounts, the irregularities stood out immediately. They recognized the red flags. Patterns that suggest either gross negligence or intentional mismanagement. And then there were the hidden documents, files stored on private servers, emails archived without official oversight, and spreadsheets that only a few people had access to. When auditors and investigators finally gained access, the documents revealed transactions that had never been publicly reported, funds moved between accounts without clear justification, and internal notes questioning the appropriateness of certain expenditures. These were not small errors. They represented millions of pounds in donations and sponsorships. One particularly shocking document revealed a transfer of funds labeled as event coordination, but the payment went to an account linked to a third-party contractor with no prior association with the games. The email approving the transaction came from a senior aide in Harry's office, referencing the prince's tacit approval. At the time, it was an isolated entry, easily dismissed by some. But when investigators pieced together multiple similar transactions, a concerning pattern emerged. The emotional impact on those involved cannot be overstated. For whistleblowers, there was fear of public scrutiny and retaliation. For auditors, there was a growing awareness that a royal charity, a symbol of hope for wounded veterans, might be at the center of financial irregularities. And for the public, once the leaks began to surface, there was disbelief. How could a figure like Prince Harry, celebrated for his dedication to service, be associated with financial misconduct? This chapter in the unfolding scandal also highlights the human cost of institutional loyalty. Many of those who worked for the Invictus Games were deeply committed to the mission. They believed in the athletes, the stories, and the transformative power of the games. But when the documents surfaced, they had to confront the possibility that their hard work had been compromised, or at least overshadowed, by mismanagement at the highest levels. Curiosity gaps emerge here. What exactly did these documents reveal? How far back did the irregularities go? Were there deliberate attempts to obscure financial records, or was it simply a failure of oversight? And most importantly, what role did Prince Harry play in approving, ignoring, or authorizing these transactions? These are the questions that investigators are now racing to answer, and the answers are likely to shock anyone who has followed Harry's journey from soldier to prince to global humanitarian. As the leaks continued, media outlets picked up fragments of information. Headlines hinted at financial mismanagement without revealing full details. Social media users speculated, critics questioned, and supporters defended. But the tension was building, and the narrative was shifting. The Invictus Games, once a symbol of triumph and resilience, was now under intense scrutiny. And then came the first public hints of legal involvement. Investigators, armed with documents and testimonies from whistleblowers, began looking at the financial trail with a critical eye. Questions were raised about the allocation of funds, the approval of payments, and the transparency of the charity's operations. For Prince Harry, the stakes had suddenly escalated from reputational risk to potential legal jeopardy. The implications were staggering. If misuse or embezzlement were confirmed, it would not just affect Harry's public image. It could impact donors, sponsors, and most importantly, the veterans who had relied on the support of the games. The scandal had the potential to undo years of positive work, leaving a legacy tarnished and a prince facing questions he may never have imagined. But perhaps the most unnerving aspect was this. The full scope of the documents had yet to be revealed. Whistleblowers had provided only a fraction of what investigators would eventually uncover. Hidden transfers, unaccounted for expenses, and internal communications still lay beneath layers of confidentiality and secrecy. The narrative that would emerge in the coming months would challenge assumptions, reveal uncomfortable truths, and force the world to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about Prince Harry and the Invictus Games. And so, the stage was set. Whistleblowers had spoken. Hidden documents had surfaced. Auditors and investigators were ready to delve deeper. And the world was about to witness the first public tremors of a scandal that would shake the monarchy, the charity sector, and the very public perception of a prince once celebrated as a hero. How could a global charity, championed by a prince, allow red flags to go unchecked for years? How could warnings from staffers, auditors, and even volunteers be overlooked or dismissed, while millions of pounds flowed through the organization? This is the critical question that underpins the next chapter of the Invictus Games scandal. The answer lies in a combination of human error, organizational complexity, and the shadow of celebrity influence. The first warning signs were subtle, almost imperceptible. A staffer noticed an invoice that didn't match the services rendered. An auditor raised a question about a transfer between accounts. A volunteer noticed that certain sponsorship funds weren't appearing in the categories they were meant to support. On their own, these instances might have been dismissed as minor clerical errors. But over time, a pattern began to emerge, one that could no longer be ignored. Insiders have described internal meetings where concerns were raised, only to be met with vague reassurances. "It's under control," they were told. "Harry approved it." Statements like these, while meant to instill confidence, often serve to shut down further inquiry. The very people responsible for oversight, administrators, accountants, and senior aides, were effectively silenced, either by loyalty, fear, or the implicit authority of the prince. This culture of deference created an environment where mistakes could compound. Each warning that went unheeded allowed the irregularities to grow larger, more complex, and increasingly difficult to trace. Small oversights became significant discrepancies. Unverified transactions accumulated. The lack of rigorous checks and balances set the stage for what would ultimately become an investigation into alleged misuse of funds. Consider one reported example. A multi-thousand-pound payment labeled as event expenses was approved without proper documentation. The funds were intended for athlete accommodations, but receipts were either missing or inconsistent. When questioned by a junior staff member, the response was non-committal, emphasizing the prince's approval over procedural accountability. This pattern repeated itself across multiple events, each time adding layers of complexity and confusion to the financial records. Even external audits, when performed, failed to catch every irregularity. The charity had multiple layers of oversight, but the systems in place were not robust enough to detect subtle mismanagement or intentional diversion of funds. Auditors later noted that while the reports appeared compliant on the surface, deeper investigation revealed inconsistencies that raised serious questions about financial stewardship. The irony is palpable. Prince Harry, the public face of integrity and dedication, was surrounded by internal warnings that, if acted upon earlier, might have prevented the crisis. The prince's devotion to the mission, his focus on athletes, media events, and public appearances, left less attention for meticulous oversight of operational details. And those responsible for finances either lacked the authority to enforce accountability or were too cautious to confront a royal figure directly. Red flags also emerged in the form of conflicting accounts from staff members. Some described being instructed to move funds without documentation. Others were told to prioritize speed and efficiency over thorough auditing. While these directives may have seemed minor or procedural at the time, they created gaps in accountability. These gaps, once aggregated, formed a financial landscape ripe for scrutiny and potentially for allegations of misuse. And yet, the public continued to see a narrative of triumph. The Invictus Games were celebrated worldwide, with images of smiling veterans, cheering crowds, and speeches full of hope. No one outside the inner circle suspected the storm brewing behind the scenes. The dissonance between public perception and internal reality was growing, setting the stage for the explosive revelations that would soon follow. The human element cannot be overlooked. Staffers reported feeling trapped between loyalty and ethical responsibility. Some feared losing their positions if they pressed too hard. Others were concerned about damaging the reputation of the prince or the organization. This culture of fear and deference, combined with admiration for Harry's mission, allowed red flags to remain unaddressed far longer than they should have. Financial mismanagement, whether intentional or not, thrives in environments where warning signs are ignored. In the case of the Invictus Games, multiple indicators, from missing receipts to inconsistent bank transfers to undocumented approvals, were present. Yet, for years, these warnings were effectively minimized or rationalized away. The message was clear: the prince's vision was untouchable and operational concerns were secondary. This is the tension that drives the narrative. A revered public figure, a well-intentioned mission, and a growing financial vulnerability all coexisting until the inevitable confrontation. When the discrepancies could no longer be ignored, the fallout was swift and dramatic. Auditors dug deeper. Whistleblowers came forward with detailed documentation. Investigators began tracing the money trail in ways that were previously impossible, and the consequences of ignoring red flags began to ripple outward. Sponsors questioned allocations of funds. Donors demanded accountability. Volunteers and staff members wrestled with the ethical implications of their continued involvement. The very people the Invictus Games were designed to support, wounded veterans, were caught in a web of uncertainty, as their trust in the organization was threatened by allegations of financial mismanagement. What makes this moment especially critical is that it reveals the systemic vulnerabilities within high-profile, charitable organizations. No matter how noble the mission, no matter how compelling the public image, oversight cannot be assumed. Systems must be robust, processes must be transparent, and those in charge, no matter how beloved, must be held accountable. The Invictus Games, for all their acclaim, demonstrated how easily red flags can be ignored when charisma and mission overshadow operational rigor. And then came the breaking point. Internal reports, combined with whistleblower accounts and hidden documents, painted a picture that could not be dismissed. Multiple transactions lacked proper authorization. Funds meant for athlete support were either misallocated or untraceable. The red flags that had been ignored for years now demanded action, and investigators were ready to move. The tension escalated rapidly. Questions about Harry's role, knowledge, and responsibility began to dominate internal discussions. Could he have been unaware of the financial irregularities, or had he, knowingly or unknowingly, enabled them? The distinction would become central to both legal scrutiny and public perception. But the most shocking aspect was yet to come. While auditors and whistleblowers uncovered troubling patterns, documents surfaced that suggested a deeper, more complex web of financial decisions that could implicate high-level advisors, external contractors, and potentially the prince himself. The question was no longer simply about administrative oversight. It was about accountability, legality, and the potential for criminal investigation. And so, as the world prepared for the next revelation, one truth became undeniable. Ignoring red flags had set the stage for a scandal of unprecedented magnitude. The Invictus Games, a symbol of hope and resilience, now teetered on the brink of controversy. And Prince Harry, once celebrated as a hero, faced a reckoning that could redefine everything. The moment had arrived. The whispers, the leaked documents, the mounting red flags, all of it had coalesced into something undeniable. The Invictus Games were no longer just a symbol of triumph and resilience. They had become the epicenter of a growing scandal, one that would draw the attention of law enforcement, auditors, and the global media. And at the center of it all stood Prince Harry, facing the unimaginable prospect of an official investigation into alleged misuse and embezzlement of millions of pounds. It began quietly. Financial regulators, alerted by reports from auditors and whistleblowers, requested access to the organization's records. Initially, the reviews were meant to be routine audits, a way to verify that the charity was managing donations appropriately and that funds were being used as promised. But what started as a procedural check quickly escalated as irregularities emerged. Multiple accounts revealed transactions without proper documentation. Donations earmarked for rehabilitation programs had been redirected. Invoices didn't match expenditures. The trail, once obscured by layers of administrative complexity, was beginning to reveal itself in stark detail. Investigators moved meticulously, aware of the high-profile nature of the case. This was not just a charity. It was a royal-led initiative, a cause beloved by millions, and a public symbol of Prince Harry's dedication to wounded veterans. Every step had to be documented, every communication reviewed, and every transaction scrutinized. There could be no errors, no room for ambiguity. because even the smallest misstep could have enormous repercussions. Sources close to the investigation describe a sense of urgency within the team. They were working against the clock, knowing that media leaks could occur at any moment, that public speculation could escalate, and that Harry's reputation hung in the balance. The initial focus was on verifying the legitimacy of transactions, tracing the flow of funds, and understanding who had authorized payments and under what circumstances. But as the review deepened, investigators realized that they were dealing with more than minor bookkeeping errors. There was a pattern, a complex network of approvals, transfers, and decisions that required careful untangling. Meanwhile, the pressure on Prince Harry began to mount. Though he was not publicly informed of every investigative detail at first, the awareness that an official review was underway could not be ignored. Advisors urged caution, legal counsel became essential, and communications with staff and auditors were closely monitored. The stakes were extraordinary. On one hand, Harry had spent years building the Invictus Games into a global institution. On the other, he now faced the possibility that his work could be overshadowed by allegations of financial misconduct. The media, always attuned to royal developments, quickly picked up on hints of the investigation. Reports of financial scrutiny and internal concerns began to circulate. Social media exploded with speculation. Supporters expressed shock, while critics questioned how a charity led by a royal could allow such irregularities. Yet for those directly involved, the situation was far more nuanced. There was a distinction between errors, oversight, and potential wrongdoing, a distinction that investigators were painstakingly attempting to define. As the investigation progressed, auditors discovered that some of the more significant irregularities involved transactions approved at the highest levels. Certain funds had been moved between accounts in ways that lacked clear justification. Invoices were missing, duplicate payments appeared, and contracts for services were sometimes vague or incomplete. While these findings did not automatically implicate Prince Harry, they raised critical questions about oversight, authorization, and accountability. One key discovery involved a multi-million-pound sponsorship deal that had been partially redirected to an account outside the standard financial channels. Emails suggested that senior advisors were aware of the transfers, but it was unclear whether Harry himself had approved them or had been informed. This ambiguity became a central focus for investigators. At what point does delegation become responsibility? And at what point does inaction constitute negligence, or even complicity? The investigation also revealed internal tension within the charity. Some staffers had attempted to address discrepancies early, only to be reassured or silenced by senior management. Others feared retaliation or the perception of challenging a royal authority. This culture of deference, combined with complex financial practices, created a perfect storm. The very systems designed to protect the charity from mismanagement had, in effect, facilitated it. Public interest intensified as snippets of information emerged. Questions about the allocation of funds, transparency, and accountability dominated headlines. Document leaks, some accidental and some deliberate, fueled speculation. How much did Harry know? When did he know it? Could the prince truly be unaware, or was he turning a blind eye? These questions became central to the narrative, capturing global attention and placing unprecedented scrutiny on both the charity and its founder. Legal experts weighed in, emphasizing that the investigation's scope was broad. They noted that high-profile charitable organizations, particularly those led by celebrities or royals, faced dual responsibilities: operational oversight and public accountability. Failing in either can have serious consequences, including legal action, reputational damage, and loss of donor confidence. For Prince Harry, the combination of personal involvement and public visibility heightened the stakes enormously. The emotional toll on those involved cannot be overstated. Auditors and investigators felt the weight of examining not just financial records, but the legacy of a cause that had inspired millions. Staffers who had devoted themselves to the mission faced moral and ethical dilemmas, balancing loyalty with truth. And for Prince Harry, the realization that the investigation could redefine his public persona added a layer of personal stress to an already intense professional crisis. Perhaps the most critical aspect of the investigation was its uncovering of patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. What had been dismissed as minor errors now appeared as systemic issues. Funds were misallocated, documentation was incomplete, and oversight was inconsistent. The cumulative effect was a trail of evidence suggesting that the charity's finances were far more vulnerable than anyone had realized, and that potential legal and reputational consequences could be severe. As the review intensified, investigators began contacting external stakeholders, sponsors, donors, and partners who had contributed to the games. They sought to understand the impact of the irregularities and to verify the flow of funds. These interviews added another dimension to the investigation, revealing both the reach of the potential misuse and the growing concern among those who had trusted the charity. And while Prince Harry remained a figure of public fascination, the investigation introduced a new narrative, one of scrutiny, accountability, and potential legal jeopardy. Every decision, every approval, every transfer of funds was now subject to examination. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were immediate, tangible, and potentially devastating. The investigation marked a turning point. What had begun as internal concern and whistleblower reports had transformed into a formal review with real-world consequences. The Invictus Games, once a shining example of hope and resilience, now faced an unprecedented crisis. And at the center of it all, Prince Harry confronted the reality that even the most celebrated achievements can be shadowed by allegations, documentation, and scrutiny. Once news of the investigation into the Invictus Games reached the public, the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. A story that had simmered quietly behind closed doors, financial irregularities, whistleblower reports, and missing documents, erupted into a global media frenzy. Headlines screamed accusations, analysts debated implications, and social media users shared, speculated, and sometimes sensationalized every fragment of information. For Prince Harry, the stakes were no longer just legal. They were intensely personal, reputational, and emotional. The coverage began cautiously. Initial reports framed the investigation as financial scrutiny or audit review, careful not to imply guilt prematurely. But as leaked documents surfaced and insider testimonies were cited, the tone shifted. Major newspapers ran stories suggesting mismanagement of millions of pounds. TV anchors and radio hosts dissected every detail of the money trail. Even commentators with previously neutral views began questioning the prince's role, asking how a royal-led charity could allow such discrepancies to occur. Social media amplified the frenzy. Platforms like Twitter and Instagram became battlegrounds for speculation and outrage. Hashtags trended, memes circulated, and public sentiment was divided. Supporters defended Harry, emphasizing his long-standing commitment to veterans and framing the investigation as an overblown reaction. Critics seized on the potential misuse of funds, questioning whether a figure of such privilege could ever be held accountable, or if the elite were operating in a different set of rules altogether. For Prince Harry and his team, the media storm created a unique challenge. On one hand, public opinion could not be ignored. The charity relied on donor trust, sponsor support, and a reputation for integrity. On the other, every statement carried risk. Misworded comments could be spun into admissions of guilt, while silence could be interpreted as avoidance or concealment. Navigating this high-pressure environment required legal strategy, media advisories, and meticulous coordination with advisors. Yet even the most carefully crafted messaging could not fully control the narrative. Part of the challenge stemmed from the contrast between Harry's public persona and the allegations. For years, he had been celebrated as a champion for veterans, a prince who used his privilege to uplift others, and a humanitarian committed to making a tangible difference. His appearances at the Invictus Games, speeches at international events, and personal engagement with wounded soldiers created an image of integrity and dedication. The idea that financial misconduct could be linked to him, even indirectly, was jarring, creating cognitive dissonance for the public. Media outlets also highlighted the human angle. Veterans who had benefited from the games, staffers who had devoted themselves to the mission, and donors who had contributed millions were suddenly cast into the narrative. The reporting wasn't just about money. It was about trust, accountability, and the potential betrayal of a cause that many had come to love. Headlines juxtaposed images of smiling athletes with discussions of missing funds, creating a stark contrast that captivated audiences. Analysts began breaking down the potential consequences. Legal experts discussed the severity of the investigation, the possible implications for charitable governance, and the reputational fallout for the royal family. Economists and charity consultants examined the financial practices, questioning whether operational systems had been robust enough to prevent misuse. Every discussion, report, and analysis added another layer of pressure on Harry, forcing him to confront a situation that could affect not only his legacy, but also the very organization he had built. Public reactions varied widely. Some were outraged, demanding transparency and accountability. Others expressed skepticism, noting the prevalence of audits and the possibility of errors rather than intentional wrongdoing. Supporters cited Harry's history of military service, his dedication to veterans, and his humanitarian track record, framing the investigation as an unfortunate, bureaucratic challenge rather than a reflection of character. Yet, even the most loyal fans could not ignore the mounting evidence, the leaked documents, and the ongoing scrutiny. One particularly powerful element of the media coverage was the framing of Harry's personal journey. Journalists highlighted the irony. A prince who had dedicated his life to service, who had sacrificed personal comfort to support veterans, now facing allegations of mismanagement. The narrative was compelling because it was paradoxical. It asked audiences to wrestle with complexity. How could someone so committed, so publicly compassionate, potentially be implicated in wrongdoing? The story was no longer just about charity. It had become about morality, accountability, and the fallibility of even the most celebrated individuals. Social media commentary also introduced a new dynamic, real-time public judgment. Every new leak, every statement, and every update triggered waves of reactions, sometimes constructive, sometimes hostile. Some users speculated about hidden motives, while others attempted to piece together the timeline of events. The virality of the story meant that even minor revelations were amplified, adding to the pressure on Harry, his advisors, and the charity's leadership. Meanwhile, international media began covering the story, bringing global attention to the scandal. Countries that had previously celebrated the Invictus Games for their inspirational message now questioned governance and accountability. The ripple effect was enormous. Sponsorships could be reconsidered, donations could decline, and the credibility of the games could be undermined worldwide. What had once been a feel-good story about resilience and triumph had now become a cautionary tale about trust, oversight, and the fragility of public perception. And yet, amidst the chaos, there were hints of strategy. Harry's team worked tirelessly behind the scenes to manage the narrative. Legal counsel coordinated with media advisors to release statements that reassured the public without conceding fault. Donor communications emphasized transparency and commitment to auditing practices. The messaging sought to balance accountability with defense, highlighting ongoing investigations while maintaining public trust. However, no strategy could fully contain the human drama unfolding in the public eye. Analysts debated Harry's possible knowledge and involvement. Former staffers were interviewed anonymously, their testimonies shaping the narrative. Financial experts discussed the potential impact of mismanagement on the charity's long-term operations. Each new detail added complexity, nuance, and tension to a story that had already captured global attention. For the prince himself, the media frenzy introduced unprecedented scrutiny. Every public appearance, every statement, and every gesture was examined, interpreted, and reinterpreted. The story had moved beyond the charity into the realm of personal reputation, raising questions about integrity, leadership, and accountability. The world was watching, not just the investigation, but how Harry would respond, adapt, and navigate a crisis that combined legal risk with moral and emotional stakes. This chapter also underscores the power of perception. Even in cases where intent is ambiguous, public reaction can have lasting consequences. Donors may withdraw support, sponsors may reconsider partnerships, and the reputation of an individual or an institution can be damaged irreparably. For Prince Harry, the media frenzy amplified every question, magnified every irregularity, and heightened the stakes for what was already an intense and highly sensitive investigation. And now, as the story continued to unfold, it was clear that the next chapter would bring the investigation into even sharper focus. Documents, testimonies, and public scrutiny were converging, creating a perfect storm. Every decision Harry had made, every transaction, every approval was about to come under scrutiny in ways that would test the very foundation of the Invictus Games. The moment the investigation into the Invictus Games intensified, a new dimension entered the story: legal scrutiny. What had begun as internal audits and whistleblower reports now escalated into formal inquiries by regulatory authorities and law enforcement. For Prince Harry, the stakes were no longer merely reputational. They had become legal, with ramifications that could extend far beyond the walls of the charity he had founded. And as if that weren't enough, the situation carried deep implications for the monarchy itself. The first formal actions were cautious, procedural, but their significance was enormous. Regulators requested detailed documentation of every financial transaction over multiple years. Auditors were instructed to trace each donation, sponsorship payment, and operational expense with forensic precision. Every account, every invoice, and every transfer became subject to scrutiny. And in cases where